Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raj Patel, and I'm the Chief Equities Strategist at Itaú. I'm joined by Marcelo Aagesen, who is the Head of Global Markets and Strategy, who is our moderator. Today, we wanted to focus mostly on China, where we've gotten lots of questions from clients on the uneven economic story. Since our last update, we also have gotten earnings from large US retailers and some select technology companies that we can discuss briefly. We invited Laura Pita from Itaú BBA and Gina Bocelli from Itaú Private Bank that many of you know. China has clearly disappointed many investors this year, as it was expected that the Chinese economy would have a strong 2023 after being the last major economy to reopen from COVID shutdowns at the end of 2022. It has had implications for the Chinese yuan, Chinese equity markets, emerging market equities, and commodity markets like oil. Marcelo?
Muito obrigado, Raj. Bem-vindo, pessoal. Obrigado de novo pela presença.
Thank you, Raj.
Gina,
Thank you for
Laura.
your presence, Gina, Laura. I'll just give you a brief introduction, but before I want to remind you that this call can be heard or watched both in English and Portuguese. You can select the language in the bottom part of the screen. Thank you very much for your presence. Raj mentioned that the focus today is China, and it's very present on our day-to-day, both from the economic viewpoint. Our calls in the committees are usually based on what happens in China, and Gina is going to talk about that, as well as the growth engine of the world and the deceleration and how much it's been disappointing in the sense of the recovery post-COVID, which has been different from the rest of the world. So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Gina has been with us for 22 years, a chief economist of Itaú Private Bank. She is a partner, and she will answer questions. And Laura is a senior economist of BBA, focused on China, a PhD in economics, and it's a great pleasure to have her here with us, both of them. Thank you, Gina and Laura. I'll start with the first question. Maybe we should then devise the background, or at least have an understanding of the whole context. How has China been behaving? What have been the best or the main points of recovery, and how this has been impacting the world? Can you devise this overview about China? Thank you for the question, Marcelo. It's a great pleasure to be here again. It's interesting to talk about this Chinese scenario because it's been really complex lately. I think the first thing is to remember that the reopening of China is very different from the other countries. China has been through times between 2020 and 2023 of a reopening, like we said, life getting back to normal or relatively normal. Despite COVID-0, and finally, when it's been declared the COVID-0 era was finished, we started to see the reopening. We didn't expect it to be like the other countries, honestly, because once again, China was different during the pandemic. So I think this is a very relevant question. There was no income transfer for families during the pandemic. So we cannot expect a reopening that has enough consumption or excess consumption like we had in Brazil and even in the US. No Chinese family woke up with money from the government to spend when life was back to normal. So there were discussions in the beginning of the year. They considered some savings for the households, but we never agreed with this perspective, because if you look at the income of Chinese households, it was very low. This is one of the points. The second point is the following. The Chinese scenario is pretty complex. There are many concerns in the short term, which are mixed with structural concerns, because China is going through a structural deceleration. And if we think it's going to grow 10% or 8% as it used to grow in the beginning of the year 2000, it's no longer true. So when we think about structural problems, there is one important concern related to housing. The housing sector policymakers have been trying to reduce the importance of the sector in the economy. There has been some estimates from scholars that the sector has represented 30% of China's GDP. And now there is a concern that these sectors, these contractors, they were pretty leveraged, and this could bring an imbalance. So policymakers are reducing the share or the importance of this sector. And of course, we can look on the long run, and maybe this can be beneficial, but on the other hand, it can cause concerns and fears in the short term. We can't forget how stressful it was in October 2021 after the Evergrande case, which was they were defaulting, and it was really scary. So the policymakers have decided to lower the importance of this sector, the housing sector, in the economy, and it has implications for the global economy, of course, related to commodities and also other things. What are the bad news from our perspective? Is that the Chinese demand regarding housing has reached a peak. So we don't expect the housing sector to be that relevant as it used to be in the previous years. We don't see any recovery in terms of house sales because it doesn't make sense structurally to have such a strong demand as there were in previous years. And this is a domestic concern, I would say, that the housing sector. But we need also to remember the geopolitical concern, because China has been facing a challenging geopolitical situation. If we think about the separation between the US and China, it has implications for the economic growth of China, for sure. So if we think about a more isolated China, isolated from the world, then we have to think about a country that will be growing less. An isolated economy has difficulty to generate productivity, and of course it will grow less. And finally, regarding the structural aspect I was talking about, it has to do with the Chinese private sector. I think it matches this same issue of China being more isolated. You can see a Chinese business person thinking about investing in China, but then if you think it's going to be isolated from the rest of the world, then it's pretty complicated to think about that. But we also need to remember that the policymakers were very harsh with the private sector in the recent years, and this has consequences. It has generated long-term scars. So, in my opinion, the bottom line for China is a reopening that was disappointing for the rest of the world, and if compared to the rest of the world, there were no encouragement for the Chinese economy after the reopening. And there is another problem which have to do with the structural concerns. So when we look at China today, we are looking at what happened focusing on the third quarter, the fourth quarter, but we also need to discuss the more the vision and the perspective in the medium and longer run. Okay, so the reopening was disappointing. We didn't see a lot of stimulus, and the household savings are not comparable to what happened in the Western. But also there is a trust crisis, a crisis of reliability in the housing market. Yeah, people like to use this word bazooka, which has to do with the stimulus that the government may bring. And sometimes they create a bubble or something. So what can the government do, and why haven't they activated what I call the bazooka stimulus for the private sector? I don't know. Can you share with us?
Sim, obrigada. É uma excelente pergunta, né? Eu acho que
Of course, this is a great question.
primeiro ponto,
I think
os
there's
policymakers
one thing.
aprenderam pouco
Policymakers have
que
learned a
quando dão
lesson.
estímulos, depois a
When
conta chega, né?
they
Então, ali em
give a
2008,
stimulus,
quando
then
deram
they have other
estímulo
problems, such as,
exagerado,
for
né,
example,
de
in
4 trilhões de
2008,
RMB,
it was
né?
an
Máximo
exaggerated stimulus with
depois
4
tiveram que
billion,
arcar
if
as
I'm not
consequências.
mistaken, and they
2015
had to pay
também.
the price.
2020
The same thing in
tiveram
2015.
estímulos, mas
Well,
foram
what about
estímulos,
2020?
até se
There were
comparar com
some
outros
stimuli,
países, foi
but
bem
if you
menor, né?
compare
Então
with
a
other
gente tem que
countries,
entender,
it
eu
was
acho que
much
tem que
less.
entender que a China
So we
está
need to
preocupada com
understand
essa
that
desaceleração
China
estrutural.
is worried
E eu
about
acho
its
que outro
structural
ponto
deceleration.
que
And there's another point
talvez
too.
esses estímulos não sejam tão eficazes quanto foram
Maybe
em
they're
ciclos
not
passados.
as efficient as they
Se a
have
gente
been in
pensar
previous
aqui,
cycles.
se a gente já viu que a demanda estrutural por casa na China já
Because
chegou
we've
num
seen
pico,
that the structural demand for
adianta
housing in
muito a
China has reached a
gente,
peak, so it doesn't
o
make any
governo virar e falar assim,
sense
olha só,
for
vou
the
diminuir a
government
taxa
to
de
say that
juros
they're going
para
to lower the
hipotecas,
interest rates for housing
ajudar as pessoas para comprarem novas casas,
and
as
help
pessoas
people buy new
não têm essa
houses
demanda
because
para
there's no
essa
such
compra de casa.
demand
Ali em
for buying
2008, ali em
houses now.
2015,
In
existia essa
2008
demanda.
and 2015, this
E aí
demand
eu acho
was
que
real.
terceiro ponto é que eles
And
estão
there's a third point.
muito receosos com a
I
parte
think they are
fiscal,
afraid with
né?
the fiscal
Eu acho que a
aspect
parte do fiscal
because
ali, eles poderiam, nessa parte de housing,
with
poderiam
housing,
fazer o que eles fizeram
they could do what they
em
did
2015. Em
in
2015, eles fizeram
2015.
programa que chama Shed
They
Town
had a
Innovation.
program called Shittown
programa
Innovation.
Simplificando, foi programa
It was
onde
a
o governo
program
entrou com a
where the
bazuca
government
mesmo,
started with the
para
bazooka
ajudar a limpar
style
os
stimulus
estoques de
package to
casa,
try to clean
ajudar a reviver a demanda de casas,
actually
mas
to
entrando com
relive
dinheiro
the demand for housing, but with money from public
Isso
accounts
poderia ser
and
feito, isso
public
chegou
budget. It could have been done.
eles estavam pensando.
We've
Mas eu acho que a
actually heard
resistência dos
rumors about
policymakers
it,
de
but
fazer
the
estímulos
resistance from policymakers
e
to offer
gerar
this type of stimuli in
desequilíbrio na
general,
economia está bem
when there is
maior
an unbalance in the
agora,
economy,
tá? Então,
which
acho
is
que,
much
mais uma
bigger
vez, a
now,
gente
I
vai
think
ter
it's
que
more
acostumar, o
concerning. So
mundo vai
once
ter que
again, we'll
acostumar com
have
um
to
cenário
get
de China
used to it
crescendo menos.
with
Então, eu fico com
China growing
essa
less.
visão de que
So
pode
this
ser que
is
os
my
estímulos
perspective that
sejam
maybe
menos
the
eficazes,
stimulus
aquele ponto,
packages are
e eu acho
less
que tem uma resistência
efficient,
aí
but I
de
think there is
gerar
certain
outras bolhas
resistance in
em
generating
outros
other
setores, né? E aí
bubbles in
também
other
casando
sectors.
aqui uma preocupação com
And also, there's
geopolítico,
another
né?
concern with the
São várias
geopolitical
frontes
aspect, as I
que
said.
o
These are
Xi
different
Jinping ali está enfrentando, né?
aspects,
O
the
doméstico, externo.
different problems
E
Xi
aí eu acho que
Jinping
tem
has been facing internally and
uma
externally.
outra questão
And
que
finally,
para
there
mim é
is
mais
another
preocupante,
thing
né?
which
Eu acho
for
que
me is even
ponto
more
que outros
concerning.
economistas
And I think some
que cobrem China também
economists
compartilhem dessa
covering
visão.
China share
Que quando
that perspective with
quando a
me.
gente fala de estímulo de bazuca de China
It has to
agora,
do with the
a
bazooka
gente
style
não está
stimulus
querendo mais
package.
olhar
we're
olhando
no
da perspectiva
longer
do que seria bom para a
looking
economia
from the
chinesa,
perspective of what would be good
não
for
seria
the Chinese
estímulo para
economy.
compra de casa,
It
mas
wouldn't
sim
be
da
for
parte do
purchasing
consumo.
houses or anything,
Porque a
but for
China tem que fazer
consumption,
rebalanceamento da
because China
economia
needs to rebalance
para
its
mais
economy
consumo, mais
to
serviços
have
e
more
menos
consumption, more
investimentos e menos
services,
dívida.
and less
Isso tem que
investments.
acontecer, né? Se a
This
gente
needs
lembrar,
to
consumo
happen. If we
nos
take
Estados
into
Unidos é entre
account
70%
that
e 80% do
consumption in the
PIB
US is about 70 to
na
80%
China
of the
55%
GDP,
do PIB.
and
Só que eles têm bastante resiliência,
China
acho que a
is about
preocupação,
55%. So they're
enfim,
very
a
resilient. They're
preocupação de que
concerned
a poupança das famílias ainda tem que ser
about
elevada,
the savings
questões
of the households
estruturais,
that have
enfim, eu
to
acho
be
que
high due to
entra
structural
outro tópico,
issues.
mas
So this would be
seria
just another topic.
se eu ficasse,
But
se a gente acordasse aqui
if we
com
were to
headlines de estímulos
wake
para
up with the
consumo, eu
headlines
olharia
of a
isso com
consumption stimuli,
talvez o mercado
then
não ia raliar
I
tanto em termos de commodities,
think
mas eu
the
viria
market
com
would be
bons
better in
olhos
terms of
em termos do
commodities.
rebalanceamento
And
de estímulos.
I would think it would be a good thing for rebalancing China.
Fazer uma pergunta, mas de
I
qualquer
have a
jeito, qual é a
question.
nossa projeção de crescimento
Still,
do PIB
what
no ano
are
que vem,
our
né? Quer
growth
dizer,
projections for
ainda
the GDP
mantendo
next
ali
year?
mais ao
Still
redor de 4, não?
maintaining around
Isso, a
4?
gente vai
Yeah,
divulgar uma nova
we
revisão
are
de
going to
cenário
release a new
amanhã.
review
Então, a gente já tem
tomorrow,
crescimento perto de 5%
reconsidering this
esse
scenario.
ano.
We have a
A
growth
gente já tinha
around 5%
crescimento de
this year, and we
4,3
had a
para
growth
o
of
ano que vem,
4.3 for
o
next
view
year.
do mercado foi mais para perto
And
desse
the
número, tá?
market view
Que
was
acha que é
about
isso, é
that,
4%, e nas nossas
4%.
estimativas de PIB
And we
potencial,
also have
é isso,
estimates for the
4%
potential
por mais
growth
uns 5
wouldn't be
anos,
more than
e depois
4% for
convergindo
about
para
5 years.
3%, e
And
por
then
fim
we could
2%
converge
até
to
2050,
3
mais
and
ou menos.
finally
Então, mas
2%
acho que
until
é isso, né? Acho que
2050.
é isso meio que o governo está procurando,
Yeah, so
não?
I
Acho
think
que
this is
proteger
what
o
the
crescimento
government's
para ficar
looking
nesse nível aí,
for
né?
to protect growth so they could
4,5,
maintain this
né? Não é
level
nada
around
para
4,
acelerar muito isso,
4.5
né? Eu acho
to
que
it
essa é a
won't
mensagem,
accelerate
né?
more
Quer dizer,
than
qualquer
this. Maybe
risco de
this is
você
the
aceita
message.
muito baixo
Any
disso,
risk of
talvez
us going to lower than
eles ajam
this,
assim de uma maneira
I
mais
think they
decisiva,
Mais
may be
agressiva.
more
Pode ser.
decisive or aggressive in
Pode
their
ser, eu acho que
actions.
vai
Yeah,
no
maybe
ponto de que, olha, eles não querem fazer
we
estímulos
have to take
excessivos.
that
Mais
into
uma
account.
vez,
They
acho
don't
que o
want to
mundo
offer
tem que se adaptar com
excessive
a China
stimuli,
crescendo
but the
menos.
world has to adapt
Com a
with a
China
China that is
crescendo
growing
exatamente mais baixo.
less.
Esse ponto é excelente. Talvez um
Eu,
crescimento
Yeah, this
previsto
is a
muito mais
very
baixo.
important point.
Sei lá,
Maybe
se
to
estamos falando de
foresee
negativo
a
aqui,
lower growth. We're
talvez
not
isso
talking
seria
about
o gatilho
negative
também para eles
growth,
fazerem
but
alguma coisa,
maybe
mas
this would be
assim,
the
também não vai
trigger for
crescer os
them to
10,
do
8,
something,
mas é
but it's
5%
not
esse ano, é 4,
it's
não
not
é
going to
uma
grow
coisa
8, 10, but
talvez
it's
tão
5
grave
or
ainda. Eles
4.
talvez
It's
estão
not
procurando esse
that
balanço entre
severe or
consumo,
serious.
redução do
Maybe they're
housing
looking for this
imobiliário, então
balance between
esse é um ponto
consumption
bom.
and
eu acho que
housing.
tem
So I think it's a very important
ponto,
point.
assim, para a gente tentar ver
There's
o
also
lado
another point we
pouquinho
need to take
positivo,
into account, which I think it's
que
pretty
esse
positive.
rebalanceamento de China,
The rebalancing of
esse
China,
rebalanceamento, essa desaceleração de China que
the
sim, foi
deceleration of
significativa, né?
China,
A gente
it has
estava
been
falando de
significant. We
China em
know that.
2019 crescendo
We're talking about
6%,
China in
e
2019
agora em
growing
2023
6%,
a gente está
and now
falando
in
de 4%, né? 2
2023
pontos do
is
PIB.
4%, so it's 2 points
Então,
of the
a gente
GDP.
olhando essa estrada de
If we
6 para
look
4%,
at
a gente tem que
this
fazer
gap,
uma lembrança, né?
we
Que a
need to
gente, olhando
remember
no contexto
something. As
mundial,
we look at the
essa desaceleração
world
de
as a
China está
whole,
acontecendo no momento
China's
que os Estados Unidos está
deceleration is
muito
happening when
forte, a
the
economia
US is
americana
very
está
strong,
muito
the
forte,
American
então
economy is very strong.
compensando um pouco essa desaceleração
So
de
it's
China, né?
compensating the
Imagina
deceleration
cenário,
in
né,
China.
mais
Can you think of
negativo, com os
a
Estados
more
Unidos
negative
desacelerando, a
scenario
Europa desacelerando,
with
e
a
China
deceleration
sendo
in
uma dor de
Europe,
cabeça
the US,
adicional,
and
né?
China
Então, eu
as an
acho
additional
que
headache?
ali em
So
2021, ao
in
longo de 2022, é claro que
2021,
tiveram preocupações sim do
throughout
mercado com relação à economia
2022, there were
chinesa, vai continuar
concerns
tendo,
of the market in
se
relation
de
to the
fato tiver
Chinese economy, and will
estabilização,
still be
é claro que a
concerned
gente tem que continuar
unless there
olhando
is
China, a gente está falando da segunda maior economia do mundo.
an
Mas a gente está
stabilization. And
num
we
cenário
have
global
to continue
diferente.
looking
A
at
gente
China,
está
of course,
falando
but
de
now
uma
we have a
economia
different
americana
scenario
super
because we're
robusta
talking about
ainda, né?
a very robust
Então, é
economy
contexto
in the
internacional
US.
diferente de
So it's a
2015, por exemplo,
different
né?
international
Antes que teve uma
scenario if we
preocupação
compare to
maior de
2015
China.
when we were more
Perfeito.
concerned about
Gina,
China.
eu vou aproveitar então e tentar fazer o link aqui para o nosso
I'll
cenário do
try to
comitê.
link that to
Então,
our context of the
de
committee.
novo, a maneira que a gente prepara, né, a asset allocation dos
The
portfólios de
way we
cliente nasce
prepare
no
the asset
comitê, onde a
allocation
gente
for
desenha um
our
cenário macro
client
com o teu
portfolio,
time
we
e a
devise
gente
the
traz os
macro
estrategistas e
scenario with
faz o
your team and we bring to these strategies and rebalance our strategies.
pensando que China é 30%
Today,
de
we
emerging
think
markets, ela é um
about
grande motor. Por
China,
mais que
it's
sentados no
30% is
Brasil, a gente
emerging
também tem
markets,
aquela
so
questão de emerging
it's
markets,
an
o Brasil é
important
emerging markets, mas na
engine.
verdade um terço do índice quase
But
é
one
China,
third
pelo
of
menos no mercado
the
de equities.
index
Então,
is China in
é
the
um motor
equities
ainda,
market.
foi
So
motor
it's
de
still an
crescimento por muitos
engine. It
anos.
has been a
Eu
growth
vi um dado
engine for
interessante
many
hoje,
years.
o IMF, né,
And
o Fundo
the
Monetário
IMF,
Internacional,
it's
calcula
what I
que para
read
cada
today.
1% de crescimento do PIB chinês,
They
isso
consider that
impacta
for each 1%
0,3%,
of the
30%
Chinese
desse
GDP
1% de
increase,
China impacta o resto do mundo. Então
impacts the rest
é
of
uma
the
potência,
world
ainda
in
continua
more
sendo
than
um motor
3%. So they're still
importante.
a
É lógico, não
power,
estou seguindo a
they're
maior
still
economia
an
do mundo,
important engine,
mas tem essa questão de
and
estar um pouquinho abaixo, talvez a recuperação de China não
they're
esteja vindo tão
a bit
forte, tem
lower,
todos esses
they're
desafios
not as strong,
estruturais,
there are many
setor
structural
privado, confiança
challenges, the
que a
private
Laura
sector,
comentou. Como é que isso tem
as Laura mentioned.
transcrito para
But how has
nossas
been
estratégias, para o nosso
it's
comitê, pelo
been
menos no cenário
translated
macro
for the
e
strategies in our
classificativo?
committee
Então,
in the
como, né,
macro
você
scenario?
sabe, os clientes, imagino também,
Well, you
a gente
know,
está mais
and I think
otimista, né?
clients
Tem
know too,
estado mais
we're more
otimista com a classe de mercados emergentes.
optimistic with
E aí eu
the
acho que tem uma
emerging
combinação
markets
de
class.
cenário
I think there's a
econômico, mas
combination
também
of an
com questões
economic
de mercado,
scenario,
né?
but
Como
also with
preço,
market
né? O que a gente chama de valuation,
aspects
né?
such
Quer dizer,
as
os mercados
price or the
emergentes, eles vêm de
valuation.
uma
The
década
emerging
muito ruim,
markets
tirando
come from a
China, né?
very bad
Os mercados
decade,
emergentes vêm de uma década muito ruim, em
with the
que
exception of
performaram
China,
muito pior
but
que o
they
resto do
had
mundo. Então, existe uma
a
questão aí
bad
de
performance if
valuation
compared to the rest of the world.
muito
So there
abaixo,
is
né? Porque se
an
a
issue
gente for
related to
olhar em
valuation, much
relação
lower
à
if we
própria média
look, for
histórica
example,
desses
the
emergentes, né? Então, eu
historic
acho que
average of the
quando a
emerging
gente
markets.
olha, né, em termos de perspectiva, eu acho
So
que tem
when we
muita
look
coisa
at
ruim já
this perspective,
precificada.
there are a lot
E
of
assim,
bad
tirando
things that have been
China, eu
priced,
acho que o cenário para o
and
resto dos países, dos
also
outros
other than
emergentes, é um cenário
China,
até
the
mais
scenario for the other
positivo, né? Se
emerging
você não
markets,
tiver
I
um
think
nível
it
de
would be
preço de
more positive
commodity
if we maintain the
elevado, um
prices
crescimento
of the
global, como
commodities
a Laura
high
falou, né? Estados
and the
Unidos
global growth, as Laura
crescendo
mentioned, the United
bem,
States
a possibilidade
still
de que
high,
né, os
and the
Estados Unidos e a Europa
possibility
estão
of
aí
the
quase no
United
fim do ciclo de
States
alta
and
de
Europe
juro. Muitos países
reaching
que
the end
subiram
of
muito
the high
juro antes até
interest
dos países envolvidos cortando juro, né, como Brasil,
period,
Polônia,
and
Chile. Então,
some
assim,
countries
isso é
cut their
recuperação de
interest
crescimento.
rates,
Então, assim,
such as
tem um
Brazil,
contexto de
Poland, and so on.
fundamento melhor
So
para o
there
mercado
is a
emergente.
better
E tem
context
a
for the
questão do
emerging
dólar,
markets, and
né? O
also
dólar,
the
a
dollar.
gente tem, né, tido essa visão de que
We've
o
had
próximo ciclo
this
do dólar é um ciclo de
understanding that the
desvalorização.
next
Já
dollar cycle
começou,
is
né?
a
O dólar
devaluation
já deu
cycle, and it has already started.
uma
The
desvalorizada, né, em
dollar
relação ao
has
pico que ele seguiu
devalued a little
no
bit
que ele atingiu no ano passado.
compared
Agora,
to the peak it
recentemente,
reached
parou um
last
pouco
year,
por causa
and
dessa
more
questão, né, do
recently it
diferencial
stopped a
de
little bit
juro. Mas,
because
assim,
of
quando a
the
gente olha os gráficos de
interest
longo prazo, né, a
rate
gente ainda continua
differential.
acreditando
But when
em
we
dólar
look at,
fraco. Então,
the
assim, acho que
short
põe tudo
term,
isso
we
junto, acho
will
que
look at
é um call que
a weak
favorece o
dollar.
mercado
So I
emergente.
think this
Obviamente, a
call
China, com
favors emerging
30%
markets.
ali,
And of course,
tem sido
China with the
uma questão,
30% has been an
mas
issue.
eu acho que também lá tem muita coisa no preço
But
já.
I
A
think there are
bolsa, né,
many
quando a gente
things
olha lá,
already
está muito
priced, like the stock
muito
exchange,
descontada
it's
por
pretty
todos esses
discounted
problemas que a Laura falou,
because of all these problems
né,
that Laura
principalmente
mentioned.
pela intervenção
And
pesada do
also
governo em
because
vários
of the
setores que eram os
intense intervention of the
carros-chefes ali, né, o
government
setor
in
de
different
tecnologia era o
sectors.
carro-chefe da economia chinesa e
Technology, for
sofreu
example, was a
muita intervenção
flagship
do
for
governo.
the
Então, assim,
Chinese
os
economy, and
preços
it
estão
suffered a lot of
bem
intervention of the
descontados,
government.
né?
So the
E
prices
assim, eu
have
acho
already
que de
been
uma certa
discounted.
maneira, talvez a
And
gente tenha
there's
chegado
another
no
thing.
fundo do pessimismo com a China, né?
Maybe
Não
we
sei se a
have
Laura
reached the
concorda,
end
mas
of our
eu acho que a gente
pessimism with
teve um
China. I don't know if
semestre em
Laura
que
agrees,
todas
but
essas
we
expectativas
had
de
a
PIB melhor
semester
foram revistas
when
para pior,
all these
né? E
better GDP
agora a gente só
expectations
fala
were
de a China
reviewed
tá ruim, mas assim,
downwards,
tem muita
and now we're
coisa
talking
ruim já
about China. But
precificada, né?
I
Eu acho que
think
qualquer
that a lot of bad things
melhorazinha
have
que
been
acontecer
priced,
ali em
and any
resposta a essas
improvement
medidas
that
que eles já
happens
tomaram, ou
in
até alguma
response to the
outra medida,
measures they
eu
have
acho que o mercado pode receber
taken,
melhor.
I think
No
the
meu ponto de vista,
market
assim,
can
eu acho
have
que
a
o
better
grande
response.
desafio
So
que
in my
eles têm,
viewpoint,
quando a
there's
gente olha para o mercado,
they
é
have a
recuperar a
huge
confiança do
challenge, which is
investidor,
to
porque o investidor
recover the
realmente saiu
trust of
muito
investors.
machucado, tanto
Investors were
local quanto
pretty
estrangeiro,
hurt
por todas essas intervenções que o
because of
governo
all
fez.
these
Então é
interventions by the
difícil, né,
government. So it's
no curto prazo,
difficult
assim, você ter uma reação
in the
muito
short run to
forte,
have
porque,
a strong
assim, o
reaction
pessoal machucou bem, né?
because
O governo fez muita
the
intervenção.
investors were really hurt. There were a lot of interventions direction from the government.
Tem muita coisa já
And I think
desse
there is
pessimismo
a
no preço,
lot
né?
of
Então,
this
assim, a gente tem uma
pessimism already
expectativa de
included in
que,
the prices.
né,
So
junto
we
ao dólar
have this
forte, com a recuperação dos outros
expectation with the
emergentes,
strong
uma
dollar
China
and the recovery of
estabilizada,
other
que esse
emerging
call
countries and a
de emerging markets
stabilized
ali, junto a dólar fraco, né?
China
Desculpa.
with the
Dólar
call
fraco,
of
com alguma melhora das
emerging
outras economias
markets
emergentes e uma China estabilizada,
and
que esse call de emerging
improvements.
markets
I think we can be optimistic about a good performance in the next 12, 18 months. And in the short run, the risk for me is the United States, not China.
Raj, a gente discute bastante isso, né?
Raj and I discuss this a lot.
An
SAP stronger concern. I think it's riskier than China.
Você acabou descrevendo os dois
Perfect. So you ended up describing the two main calls we have in international portfolios, the stock exchange of emerging markets, which has a lot to do with China. And I think you summarized something really important. Not only the Chinese scenario, but how much has already been priced and how much the valuation already reflects that. And the weak dollar and the committee, but also influencing emerging markets.
Briefly, we receive a question. So, Raj, and I think this can, Laura touched on this very briefly in terms of the decoupling between US and China and how that affects not only the companies, but the economy as a whole. And the question is, well, can you explain a little further, or at least your views in terms of the commercial relationship restrictions between China and US, and how that's going to affect negatively China as well, meaning US trying to do the onshoring or the nearshoring?
Yeah, so I mean clearly the US China relations are not in a good place, right? If you look since 2016-17, there have been a lot of restrictions that have been imposed on China. Part of it is for national security reasons, trying to change maybe what the US views as China's practices, also to protect US businesses that maybe not being treated fairly in the view of Americans. So I think there's a few different reasons, but ultimately, the US companies have tried to balance, and it depends on the exposure they have. So if you're a company like Apple and you have a lot of your supply chain in China, you sell, it's your second biggest market pretty much if you outside of the US, you're trying to balance, well, I need to protect my market and my sales in China, but I also have to be mindful of the fact that there are new risks. So companies are looking at changing their supply chains. Some of it is for risk mitigation, so it's going to be hard to move everything, right? You can't move everything at once, so it's going to take some time. But you're seeing Apple move their supply chain to India, Vietnam. Mexico's become a much bigger trading partner for the US, and so these are the things that companies are doing to try to mitigate the risks. And some of it, as you mentioned, came because of some impositions or things that the government in the US imposed to try to make it tougher to do business. And so I think all of these things are factoring into US companies changing their tone. And so that's probably the best way to explain it.
Yeah, but there's also, and I know you're going to discuss the US markets in a few, but taking the other side of this coin, right? Flipping the coin, China is also imposing some of the Apple. It's a pretty good example. I think this week we saw a bunch of headlines going through restrictions on phones and everything else.
So that's it's another example where China is trying to push back. They're trying to push back in some of the government, world organizations, but they're trying to say how can we push back? And just this week there were press reports about Chinese government agencies would no longer be able to use Apple products and iPhones. So I think they're trying, and again, I think even the Chinese government is trying to also balance it out, because some of these things can ultimately impose pain for themselves, right? If Apple continues to move supply chains away because they say, look, the government is restricting sales, then it becomes a problem. So I think everyone, look, even the US is trying to find the right balance, right? I think they're trying to push back where they think they can, and strike the right balance. But then I think the Chinese are also saying, look, the government, and I think some of it is there's been some recent legislation more at the state level to ban TikTok.
Yeah.
And TikTok is obviously a big Chinese asset, and so they're saying, well, if the Chinese are going to restrict TikTok in certain states, then how can we show that we also have some ways to push back? There was also an announcement of a new phone from Huawei, which the US has been trying to restrict, and they actually came out with a new product that actually was seemed to be pretty good. and the US is now scrambling to say, are our methods in terms of sanctions and other things working or not? So I think you're going to see small little adjustments from both the US government, the Chinese government, and companies on how they all handle this, because in the end, the companies are going to be reassessing what the rules are as they kind of happen, day to day, week to week, and month to month.
Right.
Eu acho também, Marcelo, que respondendo a pergunta, eu acho que é uma questão de
I
realmente
think it's
ambiente
also
externo tá bem
another
mais
thing.
difícil
The
para a China, não é
external
de hoje,
environment
né?
is
Eu acho que eles
harsher
começaram a
for
perceber essa
China.
restrição lá em
And I
2008,
think
foi quando
they
eles
started
fizeram a
looking at it
mudança,
in
né, para
2008 when they
mais foco no mercado
changed.
doméstico.
They
E desde o
decided to
governo
focus
Trump, eles
more
têm
on the
percebido
domestic
ambiente
market. And
externo bem
since the
mais
Trump
negativo
administration,
para
they have
eles, e essa é
noticed a
uma
more
das razões
negative
porque eles querem fazer todas
environment,
essas mudanças que
external
a Laura
environment
falou,
for
né?
them, because they want to
Voltar
make
a
all these
economia para
changes
um
that
setor
Laura
mais
mentioned,
produtivo, né? Sair
to
pouco dessa
turn the
dependência
economy
que
into
prova
more
de
productive sectors
infraestrutura,
and
né?
move away
Fazer
from
né, uma
infrastructure
mudança estrutural na
and
economia, porque eles
housing,
eles
and
sabem que
also
o crescimento
another
do setor
structural
externo não
change
vai
in the
mais
economy,
adicionar
because they know that the
PIB como
growth of the
fazia antes.
external
E uma
sector is
mas
not
por
going
outro
to
lado, também
boost
já
their
estava
GDP
preço,
as
né?
it
As
used
projeções já
to.
levam isso em
But
consideração.
these
Então, por isso que a
projections are
China
already taking this
sai do
into
crescimento tão
account.
forte
It's
que ela
already
teve para um
priced.
crescimento
That's
menor.
why
Essa é uma das razões, né,
China
Laura?
will
Essa
have
questão de que as
a lower
exportações
growth,
não vão mais
right,
tanto
Laura? Because the
adicionar tanto
exports
crescimento
are not
como
going
antes,
to
né?
add much
Sim,
as in the
assim,
past.
o que
Of course,
eu concordo com vocês, Gina.
I
Acho que o que
agree
tá
with you.
diferente
But there's one
de
thing that has changed
2018,
if we compare to
sei lá,
2008,
2017 para
2018,
agora, é o
2017,
fato da China estar mais
is the fact
isolado.
that China is more
Isso tem implicações para
isolated,
a produtividade interna.
and it has
Então,
implications
como é
in
que a China
internal
vai crescer
productivity.
se
So how
ela está
will China
isolada do resto
grow
do
if
mundo?
it's
Como ela vai?
isolated from the rest of the
Eu tenho até
world?
uma resistência quando a gente fala, a China está exportando muito carros
We
elétricos e tudo
talk
mais.
about China
Mas
exporting
assim, se a gente
electric
está falando de um
vehicles,
geopolítico super
but when we're
negativo,
talking about
quais
a
economias
negative
que vão
geopolitical
importar esses
environment,
carros
which
elétricos daqui para
economies will
frente, se o
import these
geopolítico
electric cars
piorar?
if
Então
the geopolitical
eu fico
situation
muito preocupada com esse
worsens? So
isolamento de
I am
China
more
e
concerned with
as
the
possíveis
isolation
consequências que
of
isso podem
China
ter
and the possible
para a
consequences
economia
it may
doméstica.
have for
Você
the
vê, se
economy,
você
the
quando a gente
domestic
relaciona todas as
economy.
estimativas de
When we
produtividade,
consider
está
all the
relacionada com o
estimates for
investimento
productivity,
estrangeiro na
we
China.
consider foreign
Um
investment in
gráfico que é
China.
super significativo, se você olhar o
And
investimento
if you look
direto
at
na China recentemente,
direct
está
investment
nas
in
lows,
China
nas
recently,
lows,
it's
assim,
very
menor
low,
do que Brasil e menor do que
lower
Índia,
than Brazil and
refletindo
India,
totalmente esse decâmbio. Tá?
reflecting
Eu
Eu acho
this.
que é um grande desafio como você criar
Yeah, it
tecnologia
is a major
sozinho, né?
challenge how to
Isolado.
create
Isso.
technology on
Esse
your
é o
own when
desafio
you're
daqui para frente,
isolated.
realmente.
This will be the challenge from
eu
now
vou
on.
piggyback, então, nesse assunto para fazer duas perguntas. E eu vou fazer
I
em inglês
have two
também para Raj, até
questions.
pelo fato dele
I
ser
will ask
americano.
them in
Mas
English
pensando no
to
geopolítico, no isolamento de
Raj.
China,
But
né?
if we
O
think
quanto que, eu sei que
about
a gente não discute necessariamente ruído político quando a gente olha a
geopolitics
comitiva, claro que política envolve,
and
mas
the isolation of
quanto
China, of
das
course, we're
eleições
not
americanas do ano que vem
discussing politics, but
acaba
when we think
impactando se
about
for
the American
Biden-Trump e esse
elections,
relacionamento
if
com a
it's, for
China, que a gente sabe que
example,
esse
a
provavelmente é um dos
Biden-Trump
principais,
battle,
talvez a discussão fiscal seja o primeiro
maybe
e o
the
segundo seja o
fiscal thing would
relacionamento
be
com
the
China. Eles têm
first
approaches bem
aspect, and
diferentes. O
then
quanto que isso
the
pode impactar
relationship
nos
with
nossos
China.
cenários
So how can
ou no
this
cenário de
bring
vocês? Eu não
an
sei se vocês também
impact to
discutem
our
isso, Laura
scenario? Do you discuss that too,
e Gina, claro, é para a pergunta para as duas, eu
Laura
vou fazer para o Raj
and
em inglês
Gina?
depois.
Of course, and I'll ask
Olha, assim,
that
eu acho
question
que
in English to
a
Raj
gente
later on.
discute, eu acho que é algo que a gente coloca no risco,
Well,
mas
it's
assim,
something we include in the risk, of course,
para
but
mim, esse
for
decoupling
me,
de risk China e Estados
the
Unidos veio
coupling
para
of
ficar,
risk
né? Então,
between China
independente de quem está
and
sentado na
US came
cadeira
to
lá nos Estados
stay
Unidos, vai ser o
regarding,
Trump, vai ser o
regardless of who
Impacto
will be
limitado,
sitting
então, de quem
on the
é
Eu
chair.
acho também, eu acho que,
acho
que
que
existe uma visão
Yeah, I think there
estratégica
is a
americana de que
strategic
a gente tem que
perspective
conter o crescimento da China,
that we need to
essa
contain
pretensão de se
China's
tornar o país
growth with
hegemônico,
the
a gente não vai
intention of
deixar.
them
Acho que isso é
becoming
muito claro lá.
an
Eu acho que em
hegemonic country,
relação à
and we
eleição
won't allow
americana, eu
them
acho que a
to. So,
grande
in
diferença é
relation to
na
the
posição com a
American
Rússia, né?
economy, I think the main
Que aí
difference
o
is the
governo Trump seria
relationship
muito
with
mais,
Russia,
muito
because
menos
government
agressivo em
Trump
mandar
would
dinheiro
be
para os republicanos, de
less
maneira geral, já estão
aggressive
tentando fazer isso,
in
né? Cortar
sending
os recursos
money,
enviados para a Ucrânia no orçamento do ano
sorry,
que vem
cutting
em relação
resources sent to
ao governo
Ukraine
Biden, né? Então,
if
acho que essa
compared to the
seria,
Biden
em termos de
administration. So,
geopolítica, seria a principal
in
diferença. Você ter um
geopolitical
governo
terms, I think
americano
this would be
mais,
the main
que ajudaria menos
difference.
a Ucrânia e
I
os impactos que isso
think
poderia ter no cenário
this
global, né?
Perfeito.
this
I'm
would
gonna
help
switch to English,
less,
right? Because
and this would have a change in the global scenario.
isolation of China or the deterioration of the geopolitical scenario globally, how would that be impacted by a different president, for instance, or the maintenance of the ones that we have in US? Their positions were, Gina, of course, and as we know, in the committee, it's a very limited, given it's a country position, not one man's opinion. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one comment I would make is that both parties seem to be aligned that they want to restrict China. So it's actually the one thing that they both agree on. So that's the one policy consensus between Republicans and Democrats. The rest is all nuance and tone, right? You can, some might have different approach or tone or how they handle it. But when you look at both parties, they both seem to be in the containment, opinion. So I don't think there's a big change. And we saw, right, since both administrations, we haven't seen the tariffs change or any of the actual policies, but maybe the tone and how they go about it and some of the other things, maybe there's a marginal difference, but when the overarching policy seems to be pretty consistent.
Awesome. Laura, eu queria mudar talvez a marcha e falar pouquinho de
Laura, maybe we could talk now about the long term. I want to hear the opinion of you too. We were talking about 5%. It's a market consensus and the target of the Chinese government for growth.
O que é longo prazo, né?
What does it mean when we talk about long term? When we compare China with Japan's last decade, Laura mentioned about stabilizing around 2%. So what does it mean, the long term for China?
Eu acho que tem umas dá para olhar dos dois lados, né?
I think we can look at things from both perspectives, an optimistic and a pessimistic one if we compare China and Japan. For example, the pace of aging of the population. China is better than what Japan was. I think this is very relevant. If we look at it, public debts, for example, if we take into account all the debts, hidden debts, I would say, of local governments, they're also in a higher level than what it was in Japan. So it shows less flexibility in terms of political possibilities and response. So I think this would be the three more negative points. Another point has to do with an advantage. I think that the household debts are lower than what it was in Japan. In Japan, what we saw was the following. Recession, and it affected the balance of companies and families. And what was the trigger? There was a fall of a price of an asset that was related to housing. So there was a collapse of the housing prices and deteriorated the balances for companies and households in Japan. But if we look at China now, we'll see that the balance of the families and households is better in terms of
tá bem mais tranquilo em termos de comparado por Japão.
If we compare to Japan. And a second point would be that policymakers can or have been able to mitigate a price fall of the houses.
E aí, enquanto você consegue ter uma queda, não precisa ter uma queda de preço tão significativa,
you don't need to have such a significant price fall, but you can adjust according to the quantity. If we have the same graph comparing China and Japan in terms of sales, constructions, the fall is much much bigger than what it occurred in Japan because we don't have adjustments on the side of price. So while policymakers are able to maintain this level of prices of the houses, the price control, I'm not saying this is the right policy, but they have been able to do that. And this mitigates the risk of you having a debt recession as it occurred in Japan. And there's another point. Banks in Japan, they were private, and there was no control of capital as they do in China. Banks in China are public, or state-owned, I mean. So there is a concern, of course, with China in terms of structural deceleration and the pace of this deceleration, but saying that it will be like Japan, I'm not as concerned now, because it seems that there are some market mechanisms that are lacking, that there were in Japan and are not present in China right now.
Eu acho também que uma coisa importante que
There's another important thing that differentiates China and Japan if we look at the more optimistic perspective. It's the size of the domestic market. Because if you look at the situation of China and Japan, they are similar. Some people in the call, I'm sure, remember the time when we mentioned that Japan would be the biggest economy and bigger than the US. An economy of that size. So when they started to face trade sanctions from the United States, they had no place to go because they have a very small domestic market. But China is the opposite. They have a huge domestic market, and they have been doing that already to try to move the economy back to the domestic side, to increase this domestic market, which is huge. So this is a very important difference, in my opinion. And Laura mentioned this too. How long they've been taking? They've been taking very long for deciding on consumption measures. So if we look at an economy, I want to reduce the weight of housing and infrastructure on growth. Why don't I have consumption encouragement policies? They announced they were going to cut the cost of existing mortgage, which is some income available for people, but they do have some stimulus policy, and I think it would be around this. China is still the poorest. The per capita income is very low. While Japan was already rich, with a well-developed infrastructure, with more people in the cities, while China, a lot of people can move from the rural areas to the urban areas. So I think it won't become a huge stagnation as it was in Japan. I don't know if you agree, Laura.
Não, eu concordo. I
do.
Eu acho que tem esses outros pontos também.
I think these other points are important. I'm just moving back to this topic because everybody expected China to decelerate and that this would happen anyway. But I think that there were two additional problems that have to be faced, which has to do with the geopolitical aspects we've already mentioned, but also the private sector. What is it like in China? It's hard. And it's important to present these other aspects. We look at this, China's organization 65%, which is lower than Japan, which is 80%. But if we're talking about a private sector that has been hurt and that policymakers are acting in an inefficient way,
alocação boa de recursos,
against a
será
good
que vai ter essa
allocation
migração
of
de campo para
resources, will there be this migration from rural areas
cidades? Então,
to cities?
essas duas pedras no caminho,
These
que
two
tanto o
problems,
geopolitico quanto
both
esse setor privado
geopolitically speaking
machucado,
as well as
eu
a
acho que
hard
são
private sector,
preocupações
I think these are
que ficaram mais fortes
concerns
desde
that have become stronger
2020.
since
Sabe,
2020,
Laura,
I
Não
would say.
não foi a pandemia, não foi a
It
pandemia,
was
foram
not the
essas questões, né?
pandemic,
eu acho que
but
você
these
tocou num
other
ponto que me
issues. Yeah, I
preocupa,
think
que é o
you
ponto
touched a point that
dessa
concerns me,
ineficiência
which
dos
is the
policymakers, né? Eu
inefficiency
acho
of
que a China
policymakers.
passou, desde que o Xi
I
Jinping
think
assumiu, por um processo muito
since
grande de concentração de
Xi
poder.
Jinping took office, China went
E eu
through
acho que
a
concentração de poder
time of
nunca é boa,
concentration
né?
of power,
A
and
gente
I
tem
never
todas as
think it's a good
experiências
thing.
históricas aí
We've
mostrando.
seen
Isso me
many
preocupa.
experiences
Uma concentração
in
de
the
poder que
history. So
dificulta,
this
assim, para
power
as autoridades
concentration
agirem
makes it
como
difficult
elas
for
deveriam, como
authorities
elas
to act
poderiam, né?
as they
Porque
should or
não
could.
sei se tem alguém lá para falar
I
para o
don't
Xi
know if
Jinping, ó,
there's
precisa
anyone
fazer
there
isso
to tell
aqui, e se
him
ele
that
achar que não é para
this
fazer,
or
não
that
vai
needs to
fazer,
be
né?
done,
Não, você
Exato.
não tem mais
right?
o
So
poder na China
you
costumava ser um pouco
the
mais
power in
descentralizado, né?
China was more
Era decidido por
decentralized,
mais pessoas. Eu acho que
and it was decided
do que é
by
hoje. Eu
more
acho isso um
people than what it
problema.
is today. So I
E
think
assim,
this
eu
is a
falo
problem.
isso do setor privado, porque você
Yeah, the
mesmo
thing with the
resumiu
private
bem essa
sector is
questão. A gente
exactly what you
pensava
said.
de tech,
We
inclusive quando
used
você
to
visitou a China lá em
think
2018, era
about
isso, a
tech. Remember
tecnologia,
in
você
2018,
tinha esse
technology
setor pujante
in China,
na China.
there was this
As pessoas
very
para ver tecnologia não iam mais para o Vale do Silício,
robust
iam
sector. People
Iam
wouldn't
para a
go
para
to the
China.
Silicon
Xangai, para
Valley
a
for
China para
technology. They
conhecer
would
isso
go to
tudo, né?
China to see all that.
Então, agora não
So,
tem mais isso.
but
Não tem
now
mais
we
isso.
don't
Como é que
see that
fica? Como
anymore.
é que eu vou
So
fazer
what
uma
is it
empresa
going
aqui,
to
que
be
pequena que
like?
seja, mas
A company, no matter how
potencial
small
de
it is,
crescimento, se eu não sei
with
se
a
daqui a
potential
3
of
anos
growth,
o
if
Xi
I
Jinping
don't
vai
know
virar para mim e falar assim, ó, você
if
tá
in
muito
3 years
rica, me
Xi
dá
Jinping will
a
say,
sua renda
"You're
aqui.
too
Não, é
rich, so
inacreditável.
let me get some
Complicado.
part of
Essa é a
your
situação.
money." So it's
Esse grupo do Itaú,
complicated.
dessa viagem que a gente fez, a
Yeah, this
principal
group,
visita que a gente
when
fez
we
foi
visited
na
China in
Ant Financial, que era o
2018,
braço
we
financeiro
we
do Alibaba, que
visited
na época era um frenesi,
the
porque eles
financial
iam
arm of
abrir,
Alibaba. It was
iam
frantic
fazer
because they were going to
abrir
open
capital. E, assim, um
to
mês depois que a
actually
gente foi lá, teve a intervenção,
to
suspenderam e
uh,
começou, né, o que eles chamam lá do
go to
quarto plano do setor de
the
tecnologia.
stock
Então, realmente
exchange,
isso me
but in the
preocupa.
end,
Eu acho que
after a month, I think
uma
they
centralização do poder
decided
que,
they
inclusive, para os
changed their mind.
analistas, dificulta a nossa vida,
So
né? Fica
even for
difícil,
analysts,
mais difícil
it
fazer
makes our
análise
life harder.
A
do que está
It's
previsibilidade
difficult
acontecendo ali.
to make an
Uhum.
analysis of what's
Tem uma
happening
pergunta,
there.
então, que apareceu, aproveitando
There was
antes da gente,
another
porque apareceram
another
duas, uma
question that
pro
came
Raj
up,
em relação
one for
ao balanço das
Raj in
companhias,
relation
mas
to the
aproveitando
balance
esse
of the
ponto de
companies, but
vocês, a gente
also
tocou muito no
um,
parece ser óbvio
you
algum tipo
mentioned
de
that it
estímulo ao
seems
consumo.
that
É o que o governo chinês está
since
tentando fazer, está
obvious
tentando
that the
reduzir a
government needs
parcela, a
to offer some
relevância dessa
stimuli
parte de
for
housing,
consumption,
imobiliário, para migrar para
reducing
uma
the
coisa talvez
share
um
of
pouco mais
housing
sustentável
in
a
their
longo prazo,
economy
talvez
to
esse passo
migrate
seja um
into
consumo.
something more
O que
sustainable.
mas, contrapartida, eu tenho um setor privado machucado que talvez
On
uma
the
crise
other
de
hand, the
confiança
private
dentro de casa do
sector
que fazer. O
has
que seriam
a
as
trust
políticas,
crisis. So what
quais
would
seriam
be
alguns
the
caminhos aqui que o
policies
governo
or
poderia
some
tomar? Acho que a Gina
possible
comentou
pathways for the government? I think
aumentar o disposable income de famílias através
Gina
de uma redução
mentioned
de hipoteca. Tem
one,
algumas,
maybe a
onde vocês
reduction of
acham que tem
mortgage. So
espaço,
where do you think
assim,
there's
não estou pedindo para
room?
adivinhar o futuro, mas quais são as
Not
possíveis
to, of
trilhas
course,
aqui?
I'm not asking you to
Eu
foresee
acho que
the
tem,
future,
eu
but
só
in your opinion, where do you
corrigir
see a
um ponto,
margin?
assim,
Well, I need to
que
correct
talvez eu não tenha
something
ficado
that maybe
clara.
I didn't
A
make
gente
clear
acha que o
enough.
ideal
We
seria eles
think
focarem
that
no
the best
consumo.
thing would
Só
be
que eles
them
não estão fazendo
focusing on
isso.
consumption,
E
but they are not
nossa
doing
crítica é
this
por que
now.
não estão
And
fazendo
this is our
tanto isso no
criticism.
consumo,
Why
tá?
aren't they
E aí eu
doing
acho
that?
que tem um ponto, assim, e aí
And
a
then
gente tem que
there's
lembrar
another
que a
aspect.
poupança na China é muito elevada.
Savings
A
accounts
poupança
in
das famílias é
China
muito elevada,
is
né?
very
E aí
high
tem motivos
for the
estruturais para
households.
isso.
And there are structural
A rede de
reasons
seguridade
that
social
the
na
social
China é
security
bem
network
pior do
in
que em
China
outros
is much
países, né?
worse than in other
Então, por que
countries.
que as pessoas poupam?
So
Pessoas
why
poupam
do
porque vão
people save
precisar
money?
disso,
Because
porque
they
não
will
tem assistência
need,
social, por
because
exemplo.
they don't have
Isso tem que ser endereçado. em algum momento,
Social
né?
Security. So this
A
needs to
gente
be addressed
sempre, quando
eventually.
começou a discussão na pandemia, e aí veio, falou
During
assim,
the
então as
pandemic,
pessoas
this was discussed.
aumentaram a poupança precaucional aqui no
People
Brasil, aí nos Estados Unidos,
increase
e
their
nunca mais vão voltar a
precautional
aportar.
savings
Isso
in the
só
US and
pode
in
ser verdade,
Brazil,
isso
and
não
they
foi
won't
verdade em
save
nenhum
money
desses
anymore. It
lugares, nem nos
wasn't
Estados
real
Unidos,
in any of these
mas isso
places,
pode ser verdade na China,
nor in the
porque
US,
se eu,
but it
se eu
may
não
be
tenho uma
true
rede de
in
seguridade
China
social e
because
eu
I don't
acabei
have a
de
social
enfrentar uma
security
pandemia, por que que eu
network
vou
and I've
querer
just faced the
diminuir minha
pandemic.
poupança
Why am I
precaucional? Eu não
going
sei o que vai
to
acontecer daqui uns 3
lower
anos.
my
Eu
savings
vou
account
ter que
because I
ficar
don't
mais
know what's going to
cautelosa e
happen
ter mais meu
in the next
dinheirinho
4
guardado,
years,
né?
3 years? So I need to be more
Então,
cautious and
isso tem
keep
que
saving
ser
money.
endereçado mesmo,
So
né?
this needs to be addressed too,
Endereçado
in terms of
em termos
Confiança, né?
de como vai ser feito para as pessoas
how this is going to be
reduzirem
done in the
estruturalmente
sense of
essa
people
poupança, né? E voltarem a
reducing
ter
their
um consumo
savings
maior.
structurally
Eu
and
acho que eles
start
vêm
consuming
fazendo
more.
isso, né,
Yeah, I
Laura,
think they've been
nos
doing
últimos
that.
anos, mas realmente ainda
And
a China sempre fez
China
políticas de estímulo do lado
has
da oferta.
always
Ele nunca eles
Isso.
foram
done
muito pro lado da
stimulus
demanda, né?
policies
Então também é
on
uma coisa que
the
não estão muito acostumados. E eu acho que sempre
supply
existe
side, not the
eles
demand
têm o
side.
temor de que
So
eu vou
they
aumentar a renda disponível, em
fear
vez da pessoa
that
gastar, eles vão poupar. Né? Vou mandar o
people
cheque lá
will
dos
save
Estados
more
Unidos. Aí eu mando o
money,
cheque
right?
lá, o chinês vai
I'll
pegar, vai pôr
send
no
them
banco
a
e
check
o
and
banco
they'll put
americano
it in
foi
the
lá e
bank.
gastou. Então, eu acho que são
Well, in the
muitos
US, it was the
desafios,
opposite, right?
mas
So
é isso. Eu
there
acho
are
que eles
many
têm que mudar
challenges,
a direção da
and I
política
think this
econômica,
needs to change. It needs to
sair
change the
só
direction of
olhar o
their
lado da
economic
oferta e fazer
policy,
estímulo para construir,
not looking
né?
only at
Construir
the
fábrica,
supply
construir
side and
ponte, construir
build
casa
factories,
para
build
mais
bridges,
para o lado
building
do
houses,
consumo.
but actually
É um
to
desafio
move towards
de
the
médio
consumption
prazo
side. And
que
it's a medium run
até a própria política
challenge.
de aumentar a participação do setor
Even for
industrial é de
increasing the
novo pelo lado da
participation of the
oferta, né?
industrial
Então nós
sector,
vamos produzir
it
mais
is
chip,
on the
mais,
supply
né,
side.
computador,
So
mais tecnologia,
will
né?
we produce
Mas quem
more
vai comprar
chips, more
também, né?
computers, more technology, but who's going to buy them?
Então, acho que
Exatamente.
um
Legal.
pouco tem
Não é
por
tão
esse
simples.
lado. Não é
It's
tão
not that
simples,
Mas
simple.
parece fazer
mas
sentido.
eu acho que
Próximo ponto.
eles acho que
So
podem estar caminhando para isso. Vamos
I
ver, né?
think they may
novembro a
be
gente vai
going
ver, né,
that
Laura?
way.
Foi
We'll
isso que eu
see
ia
that in
responder. Só
November.
tem um
Em
passarinho
novembro
falando
a
que
gente vai
essa
ver.
viagem
Yeah,
2018 vai
I
repetir
heard
agora, final do ano.
I
É, a
heard
gente vai ver em
rumors
novembro.
that
vai
they
fazer
will
mais
repeat
uma.
it in November.
E aí a gente conta mais.
A gente conta
And then
mais.
we'll talk
Tô
more
ansioso pra
about it.
escutar. But
I
I got
can hear
another
it.
question. It's a little bit off topic, but I think it's very important. Is we just end the second quarter earnings season, and that everything relates to China, but I think it's mostly about what U.S. companies are thinking and even publishing in terms of results. Can you share some of the highlights with us, Raj?
Yeah. So in August, we got mostly the US retailers. So Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's reported in the middle of August. And I'd say, generally the results for the biggest retailers have been good. So it seems like they're gaining the biggest market share. If you look at Amazon, Costco, Walmart, Home Depot, and Lowe's, they're doing well. If you go a step below that, it was a little bit tougher. And there are two reasons. One, there's been a problem in the US with theft. So a lot of the smaller retailers had to deal with theft, and that ended up being more than expected. So if you look at Dick's Sporting Goods, if you look at Dollar General, they said specifically that the theft in their stores was much higher, and that resulted in weaker results.
But across US or like California, San Francisco?
They said it's been everywhere.
Right.
So it's spreading. I mean, there's a lot of news about California and New York and certain states with certain policies, but it's become a widespread problem. And so and it's become obviously a bigger problem because they forecast every quarter how much do they think they'll lose from people stealing stuff. But this time it ultimately was a lot worse. And for those two specific retailers, but I think it's a trend across the board. The other piece was Macy's, for example, said that credit. So a lot of people in the US buy on credit card, right? Macy's has their own credit division. They have their own credit card. They said some of the losses there were higher and they're forecasting to go up. It's not widespread there. Macy's was one. And actually this week, a lot of the banks are presenting. And the banks in the US that have credit card businesses said, look, we're seeing some areas where credit losses are going up, but it's just normal. It's nothing out of the normal. So I think those are the results. We got some tech earnings from companies like NVIDIA and Salesforce, and those results were good. I think the one maybe disappointment was the stock price reactions have not been as large. And maybe that's because we've had, two other things that have happened in the last month and a half. And I know we discussed a little bit of this, the dollar strengthened. So that becomes a headwind from equity markets or risk assets. And the second is the interest rates had a big move in the last month and a half. So I think, maybe those two things, despite companies continuing to sound generally okay, as I mentioned, the big US retailers and the tech companies, generally have had good results. You mentioned, what other updates? Maybe I'll just make one comment. This week, the US banks are presenting. I mentioned, we got updates from, JP Morgan, Bank of America, the large US banks and the smaller regional banks. So obviously, I was keen to listen to hear what they had to say. And I think one message which was interesting is that they're saying that the third quarter is actually looking like it's going to have upside. And that's because deposits, there was, after Silicon Valley, First Republic, a lot of deposits left the banks. It's actually stabilized and actually turning out for the third quarter to be better than they had forecasted. Right. So actually seeing the banks now saying third quarter, there could actually be upside because, they were worried with the deposits leaving, they had to increase rates to keep the deposits, but that trend stabilizing to actually improving is a good sign. So, we're still 1 month left before the third quarter earnings reports, but that's a good sign that some of the banks came out this week and gave that update.
Awesome. Tá bom, gente, eu queria até aparecer algumas outras perguntas aqui, mas eu queria talvez
There
fazer
were more questions, but I think we need to do the wrap-up because of
E eu
time.
queria talvez escutar últimas
And
considerações de vocês,
maybe
principalmente
listen to
Laura,
your
Gina,
final
no
comments,
foco de China.
Gina,
Então,
Laura.
temos país que é a segunda maior economia do mundo,
We have a country which is the
extremamente
second
importante
largest
motor de
economy in the
crescimento,
world,
foi
very
durante os últimos
important, a
anos,
very important
que
growth
tem impacto
engine
grande até no
that
crescimento do
has a lot
resto,
of
que está passando por uma
impact on
dificuldade
growth
de
and is
isolamento
going
geopolítico,
through
com
a
um crescimento
difficulty
pouquinho
related to
desapontador
geopolitical isolation and a
pós-pandemia,
disappointing growth
até por
after the
causa do movimento
pandemic.
imposto pelo governo
And
de
even because
reduzir e ter
of the
políticas
government
mais
imposing a
contracionistas
reduction
pro principal, talvez,
into
mercado
more
de
contractionist
crescimento deles,
policies
imobiliário, a parte de housing.
in their
Por uma migração, talvez, de
in the
consumo, mas está
housing
passando por uma
market,
dificuldade
maybe
geopolítica e até
they're going through a
crise de
geopolitical
confiança.
difficulty
E
and
aí a
even
gente está esperando
a
para ver
trust crisis.
os próximos
So we're
moves.
now
Grande parte
waiting
disso
to
parece
see
já
the
está no
next
preço, então a gente
movement,
tem um
next
play de
moves,
emerging markets aqui em
and
equities,
we have
no
a
nosso
blend
comitê.
of
Imaginei até um
emerging
play
markets in
de dólar,
equities
você
in our
acabou tocando nisso
committee.
também. Mas quais seriam as últimas...
What would
Alguma
be
coisa que eu perdi aqui, alguma coisa extra para complementar?
is there anything I missed or anything extra you would like to say to add
Acho que
to
você
what I
resumiu bem,
summarized?
Marcelo,
I
obrigada.
think you
Eu
gave a
acho
great
que
summary.
eu só adicionaria que, de fato, a gente tem
I would
que
just say that
pensar na China
we should think of China
ver esses sinais de estabilização na atividade,
looking at these
ver
signs of
se esse
stabilization
pessimismo
and
dos
whether this
ativos
pessimism
tá
of
correto ou
related
não.
to
Acho que é isso que a
assets
gente tá
is correct or
tentando
not.
olhar nos
This is
números
what we're
por
trying to look
agora.
at
E aí, no contexto geral,
for
ver se
now.
China
And in
play tático
general,
ou não, né? Se
we'll
vale a
have
pena
to
entrar em momentos
consider
específicos
whether
ou não, né? Mas eu ainda
we
fico
should
com uma
go into
visão
more
mais
details about China,
complicada
but
nessa parte estrutural.
we see a more
Perfeito.
complicated issue in the
Eu
structural
acho que,
part.
assim, se pudesse a gente fazer
Well,
call de emerging market sem
if we
China,
could have an emerging
seria
markets
mais
call
fácil,
without
né? Eu acho que tem
China,
alguns
it would
gestores
be
que fazem,
easier. Some
separam,
managers
China e
do
emerging
that.
market.
They
No
separate
nosso
China
caso, como
and
a gente
emerging
segue
markets.
o MSCI,
We
não,
follow the
ainda não estamos
MSI,
fazendo
so
isso. Mas eu acho que seria mais fácil.
we haven't been
Eu
doing
acho
that,
que
but I think it
China,
would be easier
por ser a segunda economia do mundo, tem
because
uma
it is the
importância,
second economy
teve
of
uma
the
importância
world,
muito
the
grande
largest
para os
economy of the
emergentes, a
world, and
impressão
it
que dá
was
é que
very
isso está
important for
meio que
emerging countries. The impression I
desvanecendo,
have
né?
is
Se a
that
gente
this
olhar as
is
bolsas
fading out. If
dos
we
mercados
look at
emergentes,
the
todos
stock
performaram
markets of
melhor
the
que a
emerging
bolsa
markets, they
chinesa.
all
Então, a
had a
gente
better performance
conseguiu, né?
if compared
Mesmo
to
o
the
Brasil
Chinese
conseguiu ter
stock
um desempenho
exchange.
melhor,
So even
mesmo
Brazil
com a
had a
China
better
assim tão ruim, ajudado
performance
pelos Estados Unidos,
with
ajudado pelo Reino
even
Unido, ajudado
with
pelo
China in
commodity.
that
Então, acho
condition.
que China realmente ficou mais
So
opaco,
I
ficou mais
think
difícil de ver.
it's become more difficult to see
E tem desafio gigante
China, and there's a huge growth
fácil.
challenge ahead.
Eu acho, chego a duvidar se a
It's not
China alguma vez
easy.
vai
I
conseguir fazer o que
doubt
eles
whether
querem, que é
China
virar
will ever
país
be able to
rico,
do what
né,
they
em termos
want
de
to
PIB
become
per
a
capita,
rich
porque hoje eles são um
country
país de renda
in
média, né? O
terms
PIB per
of
capita deles é igual ao do Brasil.
GDP per capita. They have the same GDP per
Poucos
capita as
países
Brazil.
conseguiram
So
fazer
very
essa
few countries were able to transition
de renda
into
média para ser
have
rico,
a better
para ser um
going
país
from an
de
average
renda
income
alta.
to a
Então,
rich
acho que eles têm
country or
muitos
high income
desafios
country.
mesmo
So
nos
they do have
próximos
a lot of
anos.
challenges in the following
Esse
years.
assunto daria para a gente ficar provavelmente mais
We could be
bom tempo
talking
aqui.
about
Tem
that for
algumas
another
perguntas,
hour, right?
pipocando. Eu
There's
vou ver se a gente
so many
consegue
questions.
responder algumas, talvez por
I'll see
e-mail
if
ou
we
no
can
próprio
answer
app.
some of them
Mas eu quero
on
agradecer
the
muito,
app
Laura,
or by
de
email,
novo,
but I
tá
want to
segunda
thank
vez aqui com a
Laura
gente,
once
sempre
again for
prazer.
being with us
Gina,
again.
convidada
Gina,
padrão que pra gente é
we
excelente.
always love to
Obrigada,
have you
Marcelo.
here.
Obrigada,
Of course, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks,
Muito
Gina.
obrigado aos nossos clientes e para
Obrigada,
todos os
obrigada,
Thank
clientes.
you
Laura.
to all our
Tchau, tchau, gente.
clients.
Obrigada.
Tchau, gente.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Tchau.
Bye.